was my deal? Great question. So let's see. I moved to Chicago to become a software engineer. I did straight software engineering for years here, and then I started going sort of in the direction of machine learning engineering for a while, and lately my path in that area has been a little bit of a combination approach. So I found that there are a lot of principles in software engineering that apply well to data science and machine learning problems, and I found that there is an aspect of rigor to data science work that could potentially be useful inside of software engineering. So right now, I take on clients in sort of both of those areas, and I've found that there's a lot of transferable skills between the two.
So someone who doesn't necessarily know much about software engineering or data science or machine learning probably thinks that they're all the same thing. It's like, oh, you're a computer nerd.
Yeah, I would suspect that's true. And then as you get a little deeper into it and you have, say, your software engineers, they might think that they're completely different things that don't necessarily have transferable skills, particularly if somebody has stuck primarily to one or to the other in their career. In fact, I've seen this pretty frequently on the data science side because for whatever reason, there are more software engineers now of varied backgrounds, which helps some. I think in data science, it's still more homogeneous in terms of the fact that a lot of folks who bill professionally as data scientists came out of an academic program where they focused on data science, and there's not as much exposure to the principles of software engineering. So it comes from that side more than the engineering side in my experience.
Yeah, whereas a lot of software developers are quote-unquote self-taught at this point.
Exactly.
Right? Maybe not even self-taught, but informally taught, either through online tutorials or coding boot camps or working with some friend as like a ad hoc mentor or something like that.
Exactly. There are a lot of software engineers. Software engineering as a discipline hasn't grown up around an academic background in the same way.
Yeah. And if you have like a computer science degree, that can be helpful, but you also probably spent a lot of time like learning about the exact way that memory functions in a computer without even knowing what code is.
Right.
Like, what?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So are you someone who has a formal background in data science or no?
No, my bachelor's degree was in international relations. I wanted to be a spy, and that changed.
Are you a spy?
I am not a spy.
What would a spy say if you asked a spy if they were a spy?
They would say, I think that the technical answer to this is I work in the Defense Department.
Yeah.
I work in the Department of Defense, which in DC, everyone's like, okay, you're a spy.
Got
it. But that's what you're supposed to say. And then there's various security clearances, and people like don't marry outside their security clearance because then they can't talk to their spouse.
That would get complicated.
It does get complicated. It really limits the field.
Yeah.
So
so you're not a spy.
Right.
Do you work in the Defense Department?
I do not. I don't even do that. They wouldn't let me because sequestration happened right as I was graduating, and the CIA and the NSA and all these places weren't hiring for 18 months. And that's like if you don't already have a security clearance, you kind of need to work at one of those places to get one. And there's a lot of consulting organizations, Booz Allen Hamilton and these types of places that will hire you, and if you have a security clearance, but they can't use you for Defense Department contracting if you don't have one, and they have a really hard time getting you one, and so they would prefer to just hire someone who already has one. Similar to the visa situation, places want to hire someone who already has a visa, and it's like messed up, but that was kind of the way it was. I needed to find something else to do. So I blogged for this startup in Miami that absolutely folded, and living in Miami was not fun at all. But then that startup had a contract CTO out of Chicago. And so when I got laid off from the startup along with 8 other people, it was all on the same day, I reached out to that contract CTO and I asked him if he knew anybody who knew how to code and who knew how to teach. So he knew somebody here in Chicago, and I tutored with that person for a little while, and then eventually came to Chicago to work with him and get immersed and become a professional.
So you essentially have no formal educational background in either software development or data science, and those are the two things that you do.
Precisely, yeah. I did some data science in the course of being an international relations major to do statistically sound political science research, but that was it.
Yeah. So I think this is something that a lot of people are theoretically interested in, right? Like learn to code. What's the deal? And you actually did. You mentioned the, having some sort of tutor or something like that. What did that process actually look like for you? And what does that, what are the things that go into learning how to do something difficult and complicated and seemingly opaque, like learning data science or learning computer coding?
Right, exactly. I think it does depend a little bit on the person. So for me, I was working with this tutor like an hour a week, and he would help me with things, and then I was working on stuff on my own outside of that. And my learning process has been largely project-based. There are benefits and there are drawbacks to that. The benefit of having a project-based approach as opposed to like getting a textbook and reading the thing from start to finish is that I felt intrinsically motivated to learn these things for a purpose, which was working on this project that I cared about. And sometimes it was a game, sometimes it was a website to show data or something. It was always a project that I wanted to do independently of code. And programming or data science were tools that I would use to reach my end goal as opposed to end goals in and of themselves. So that intrinsic motivation helped me keep pushing forward. I think when a dense textbook would have made it difficult for me to do so. With the drawback being that inside of, say, a structured learning environment, a course or a textbook or something like that, there is somebody who knows what they're doing, who's been in this field longer than you, who can alert you to general principles that you might not necessarily come across in the course of learning how to do one project, but that maybe you should know. And so it's relatively easy inside of a project-based learning model to learn how to do some simple stuff and then some more complex stuff and then some even more complex stuff, but have left some of the what folks might call the simple stuff behind, and then you get onto a job site and some of this stuff that everyone theoretically knows, you just didn't happen to run into while you're working on your project. And so I did the project-based thing for a while, and then I found that I ended up needing to go back and learn some of the fundamentals. And what really helped with that was reading books on computer history, reading biographies of really important computer scientists, and going back and learning about the underpinnings of some of the software that I was using, some of the algorithmic stuff, some of the general maintainable software type of stuff. So I think the two different spheres of project-based and then having a more broad base, some combination of the two of them probably works for different people. And I found that I started more project-based and then ended up going back later and getting a heavy helping of the other stuff. But I do think I wouldn't have been as interested in the background part if I hadn't been doing the project part first.
Well, and having the knowledge through doing projects to create a framework that you can then actually plug in the more theoretical or historical knowledge then makes it relevant.
Right.
Right, because then all of a sudden you're oh, that's why that weird syntax is like that. Or oh, that's why this language was created because people were mad at this thing from that language. So right. It makes sense as opposed to just being here's a bunch of interesting facts.
Right.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So to sort of get maybe a little specific, you mentioned this idea of project-based learning. What were some of the projects that you worked on that you found to be particularly helpful for learning?
Yeah, sure. So what did I work on? In the very beginning, I was doing a tic-tac-toe game in Ruby, and then I did Game of Life in Ruby. But I think the things that were the most fulfilling for me were apps that I wanted to make.
Game of Life as in the...
Conway's Game of Life with the little squares, and there's different rules as to which squares light up and which don't.
Yeah, can you actually give a little background on that? Because this is essentially a very cool and interesting thing.
Yeah. So the idea is that you start with a grid of squares, and some of the squares are lit up and some of the squares are not lit up. And then each time you step through to a new set of squares, there's rules about which ones light up and which ones don't. So if I'm recalling correctly, if 3 different squares touching a square are lit up, then in the next iteration, that square is going to be lit up. But if a smaller number of squares is touching a lit up square, then that square, quote unquote, dies and it doesn't light up anymore. And it's really interesting to see how the shape of the lit up squares changes as you step through the game of life. There's a really good, if you go to the Wikipedia article on Conway's Game of Life, they have a little GIF that shows you what I'm talking about, because I understand just to hear this, it's like esoteric and weird.
Yeah.
But I do think that the GIF helps a lot.
Yeah, in terms of it's a very interesting illustration of how very simple rules and slightly altered initial conditions can result in just like crazy different outcomes.
Yeah, it's cool. It's cool to watch. I know people who have their like screensaver set to Conway's Game of Life.
Right. That would be very fulfilling and relaxing, I think.
Oh my gosh. I don't know. I would probably get nervous watching it. I don't know. I would feel
Why would you be
about it.
nervous?
I don't know, because it's like kind of mind-boggling how complicated it can get, you know,
Yeah.
and weird, and like, I don't know.
Okay, so anyway, I interrupted you. Game of Life.
Yeah. Then I started to work on more apps. So I worked on, there's this set of data that essentially tracks like violent incidents around the world. It's a very sobering database, but there weren't really good data visualizations for it. So one of the first apps that I wrote was an app to visualize some of the information around that data. And it was interesting to me because I sort of came from this international relations background, and this seemed like the kind of thing that like someone like me should be doing.
And is this something you just picked to do? Or was this like, okay, yeah, you're just like, great, I'm going to...
Yeah.
Great.
I picked it. I needed sort of a project idea, and I knew about that data. And so I figured, well, this is as good of data to learn to visualize as any. So, and I think that data visualizations are a really powerful way to learn about a bunch of different things, because you learn about data manipulation, and then you also learn about the front end aspect of like designing a visualization that people are going to understand, and then how do you implement that visualization. And inevitably, whatever you've dreamt up is like not entirely supported by the data visualization library you're using, and then you have to learn about patching other people's code and modifying other people's code. So it ended up being a really valuable type of project for an end-to-end look at a bunch of different programming problems.
Yeah, because you just start going down a rabbit hole of like, here's my vision of what I want this to be. I can't do it. Right. All right, what do I do?
Exactly.
So something that I think is interesting as a lower level intermediate person with some different computer things, right? I have projects that I work on like for my various businesses. I just try to like hack things together and make things work. And it kind of related to what you were just saying. I found that a huge percentage of my time like working on software-based projects is them not working or not doing exactly what I want them to, and just kind of like fiddling with it.
Right.
Which I think is, from my conversations with people, seems to be the case for pretty much everybody. Mm-hmm. But that I think that other people may think that that is like an indication that they're doing something wrong, or that they're screwing up, or that that's not how things should work, or that it's just frustrating and they kind of don't want to push through it. So, number one, is that your experience that most of your time is just spent being like, this isn't working or not quite what I want? And number two, what gives you the, persistence and audacity to push through and decide that you are going to, in fact, make the thing do what you actually want?
Right. Yeah. It's a good question. I think that programming, it's probably not unique in this, but I think it's probably one of a small subset of jobs where you spend like 80% of your time at the margin of what you know. And, maybe 20% of the time you're working on something that you know how to implement. But then the rest of the time you're trying to figure out how to do things that you don't know how to do. And if you already knew how to do it and it was done a whole bunch of times in the past, then almost by definition, there's like no need for somebody to hire a software engineer to build it custom. And if somebody's going to be spending that kind of money, then it has to be something that they can't go get online from somebody. And so we have to get very comfortable getting paid to like toy around with something that we don't exactly know how to do, which at that point we end up relying pretty heavily on, we like fall back on learning how to debug and learning how to learn essentially. And we'll say, well, a lot of what I'm billing to do here is to figure something out. And although I don't necessarily know how to do it, what I have is the tools to figure it out. And that's what I'm building for.
Yeah, great. So, I mean, if we think about concepts of deliberate practice, like you mentioned, you're spending a huge amount of time right on the margin of your ability, which is a very uncomfortable spot to be, kind of no matter what the skill level is, right? And there's very solid research on almost any type of skill acquisition where it's like, if you want to get better at playing guitar, you should spend a huge amount of time doing something with a metronome just a little bit faster than you can actually do it.
Right.
And it like sucks and doesn't feel good. You're like, I can't do this.
Right.
But it actually does make you better. So it's very interesting that almost by definition, like you said, software engineering is hiring people to do things that like people don't know how to do, and you have to just sort of hang out and figure it out. So is that something that do you enjoy that feeling of discomfort, or is that something that you find frustrating, or both?
I don't enjoy the feeling of discomfort, but I enjoy the feeling of having figured it out enough that I will endure the feeling of discomfort.
Okay, sure.
I have found that proportionally, and I don't think this is as true for everyone as it is for me, but like the longer I spent tearing my hair out over something, the happier I am when it finally works. And I get to prolong that feeling of happiness a little bit so I have a blog where I write about software engineering stuff. And when I figure something out that I was tearing my hair out to learn, a lot of time, like I checked the documentation online, I checked all of the resources I could find. I couldn't find a good resource on it, which means that if this is something someone's going to have to do again, and I write a blog post on how I did it, a whole bunch of people are going to get a bunch of time saved by being able to go and look at that. And so for me, finding those really intractable problems, it's frustrating at the time, but I also know that if I can figure this out, when I figure this out, I'm going to have an opportunity to make this a lot easier for a lot of other people, and I really like that.
Do you still feel really good if you finally figure something out and it was like a stupid oversight that resulted in you spending days messing around with something?
They kind of suck, but they...
Where you're just like editing the wrong file or something. Yeah. No.
So there's this is going to sound so narcissistic, but I have some coworkers who I have this principle, and because I'm always repeating this, they've started calling it the Troy principle. And the Troy principle is that as you continue to debug something, the probability increases that it's a one-line change until you get to 4 hours. And at 4 hours, the probability is statistically indistinguishable from 100% that it's a one-line change.
Yep.
So, and at that point, it's just like, what is going on? Yep. I don't know, but they suck. But at the same time, like with enough time, they're funny because every programmer has those experiences, you know? And it's helpful, like when somebody's really having a bad day and they're like, I just don't know what's wrong. You can be like, yeah, I remember that time that 4 programmers spent 6 hours figuring out that this is supposed to be a fragment state pager adapter instead of a fragment pager adapter, because we just assumed that the first line was right and it was wrong. So
what is a fragment state thing?
They are...
We need some context for the joke.
They are tools in Android that you use to make like screens that you page through. So when you like swipe, it goes to a different page, so on and so forth. And the outdated one is the fragment pager adapter, and the updated one is the fragment state pager adapter. And we inherited this app where it was a fragment pager adapter, and we thought it must be that for some specific reason, because there's no reason that someone wouldn't use fragment state nowadays. And so we just left it. And after like way too long of trying to figure out what some bug was, I even forget what it was, we were like, what if we just change this one word and see if it fixes it? And of course it did, because of course it did.
There you go. One line change.
Yeah.
So you said something really insightful about the process of getting better, essentially being learning more tools to get yourself unstuck or something to that effect. So how do you think about that? Are you thinking about, okay, I have this problem and I have all these different tools that I run through to try to solve it? Like, are you thinking in terms of algorithms to try to solve your problems? What does that look like for you?
Sure. So in terms of problem solving, I think some of it does depend a little bit on the framework and the language that you're using. But when it comes to figuring out like something intractable that I haven't figured out how to do, a lot of times my what I really want to do is reduce the feedback loop as much as possible to figure out what is going wrong. That's the first thing. I want to be able to try a whole bunch of different experiments in succession as quickly as I can. And then hopefully in the course of that, like one of the experiments works. So there are a bunch of different ways I can do that. I can try to speed up reloading the app that I'm working on, or I can write tests, and I can use those tests as my personal like little lab and run the tests. And hopefully I try different things in the code and they fail and they fail and they fail, and then finally they pass. So that's the first thing that I'll do. And I think that's generally applicable to like problems even outside of programming, is try to reduce the feedback loop to as small as you possibly can.
Yeah, so rather than having like a grand plan and be like, all right, here's what we're going to do, and I'm going to do all this stuff, you want to make small changes and then see what actually happens and see if you can get some sort of insightful feedback immediately based upon small changes. Is that a good way to think about it?
Exactly. And so that'll help. And then what I find is that identifying like a very small unit of progress is also important for me. So I might be trying to make this big change and I'm trying to get this like pie chart to appear on screen with a whole bunch of different colors in it or something. And so the first thing that I'll try to do is like, for example, maybe I just want to get a circle to show up at first. And that's nowhere near where I want to be. But those tiny incremental changes are important for me to even be able to think about the problem, because otherwise it's too overwhelming. So that kind of thing will help. And I found that applicable like generally in other things too, even with working out. Like sometimes I have to say, I want to be able to squat this much and not have it hurt. Well, first, I need to be able to figure out how to like change my position in this way and have that be more comfortable, or I need to be able to go up like 2.5 pounds in this position. And it feels really weird and strange at first, and it doesn't feel like it's going to be a big difference. But I find that as the changes compound in programming or really anywhere, the compounding changes get me to the end goal faster than it feels like I'm getting there as I'm making these small incremental changes.
Yeah, so it's something that I agree that, there's analogies in training, in business and marketing, whatever, where it feels like you're doing something so small that it's not worth doing. And we as humans tend to dramatically underestimate like the aggregation of those small changes and like the feedback loop of making like little adjustments compared to being like, oh, well, here's my huge idea for what I'm going to accomplish.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great. So you think about trying to speed up the feedback cycle and just make small changes and create incremental progress towards whatever your specific goal is. What about in terms of like learning new concepts, right? So I think that's like a pretty good principle for figuring out how to get yourself unstuck, or just like you mentioned, develop the skill set of better processes for getting yourself unstuck. But what if you're approaching something like, you mentioned, I think before we started recording, just learning different languages and having some background in, front end, back end, mobile development, like all these different things, which are related at some level, but you're potentially attacking, all right, I'm going to take this whole project of like learning a whole new language that someone has potentially spent a decade specializing in, whereas I just have like some general knowledge of how computers work. So what does your process look like for that?
Right. Yeah, absolutely. So there are a couple of things that I find really useful in that. One of them, this will sound obvious, but going to the documentation for something, usually if you have a language, there's a website that theoretically tells you how it works. Those are often out of date. And so it's not necessarily the be-all, end-all of resources, but that can be a really valuable one. There's often bloggers that talk about this kind of thing. But then in terms of general programming concepts, what I have found is that, some programmers, they specialize in one language, or maybe they write 2 languages, and that's fine. I have found that an approach that has really worked for me is to write a whole bunch of different languages. I've written 13 professionally, and I would say I was proficient in 9 of those at one point or another. And one thing that I have found is that there is some isolation of concepts within the different programming communities, but often you'll have like the way things are done in this language, but really this language could benefit from understanding more about the way that it's done in this other one. And so sometimes even going outside of the discipline that I'm in specifically and seeing how somebody else approaches it has been really useful for me. It's also common in programming for code to be made open source. There's this website called GitHub where people like to store their code and that kind of thing. And sometimes it really helps me to go and see like, how did other people do this. Like maybe there's somebody who's known for being really good at this kind of thing, or somebody who has really entertaining, angry blog posts about how it's supposed to be done. Like, how does their code look, you know? And so that can be really helpful for me, is to see examples of how other people have approached something like that. And then it makes it like I don't necessarily have to make everything up from scratch that way. I can see sort of what the path might look like from where I'm trying to be to where I am right now.
So you mentioned in one of your blog posts the process of commit tracing, which is related to that. Can you explain that? Because that's a pretty incredible thing to do, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. This is my my secret hack. There aren't really secret hacks.
Is this one weird trick?
Yeah, it's one weird trick, and it's really going to make all the computer science professors angry. So what I do, there's enough open source work that I can go into, like, say, somebody else's app. And like I said, maybe I find it on the internet, or maybe it's the app that I've been hired to work on, and now I have access to it. The way that we manage changes inside of software is with something called version control. And so every time that we make changes to an app, we commit those changes in the same way that you like press the save icon in Microsoft Word or in anything where you might save. So we now have a record of like what changes were made between these two save presses, and we can name those different saves. So for example, if I were writing a novel, I can have a save that's like add chapter 1, and then I can have a save that's like add chapter 2, and then I can have a save that's like go back to chapter 1 and change a bunch of stuff. So we have those different named saves in software engineering, and they're called change sets or commits. So commit tracing is when I go and I look back at all of those names, and I see a name that's interesting to me. Maybe the name is like update this, to go back to an example we were using before, update the pie chart to animate correctly. And I figure, well, maybe that change set can tell me something about the way that this pie chart is operating. And then I go back and I click on that change set, and I can see all of the lines of code that somebody added or deleted when they made that change set. And the way that I would do this, I used to work at a company called Pivotal Labs on teams of like 6 or 8 programmers, some of whom were much more senior to me. So I would go back and I would pick a change set by some developer who knew what they were doing, maybe theoretically, but that I thought was interesting. And I would get out some sheets of paper, and then I would take a blue pen and I would copy down by hand on sheets of paper all of the code changes verbatim that had been made. And then I would put down the blue pen and I would pick up a black pen and I would circle anything that I didn't understand. And then I would go back and I would Google all of that stuff, and I would try to learn about how it was working under the hood. And I would take a pink pen and I would write comments near those black circles. And then if I had any remaining questions, I would write those down in a red pen, and I would go try to find like an individual person who I could ask those questions to, because I hadn't found anything in the documentation. And that technique, people thought it was, I think words that were used to describe it included intense,
extreme behavior.
It's extreme behavior, maybe, but it allowed me to upskill on the technologies that I was supposed to be using in a way that just I wasn't able to get that same velocity when I was looking at a book, or when I even doing practice projects just on a specific technology. That was the way to accelerate my progress, by far the fastest.
Yeah. And did you come up with that yourself?
I did.
Yeah, that's awesome. It reminds me, I've certainly heard stories of, authors taking books that they love, or like passages that they love, and then just copying that by hand. Mm-hmm. Right? Because it's one thing to read it and be like, oh, wow, that's great. But it's another thing to be like, okay, why this word here? Why this comma here? How does this sentence go to this sentence? And it really forces you to dig in deep and understand what's going on.
Right. And one thing that's nice about software, that I don't know if this is necessarily true in writing, is that in writing it would be hard. Maybe it wouldn't be hard. I actually haven't tried this, so I can't comment on its difficulty. But when somebody is copying the writing of somebody they admire and thinking about why things are the way they are, it might be possible to like switch the words around and see if it works better for them. You know, it's very subjective and so it's hard to know. But when it comes to software, if I didn't understand why something was done a certain way, one option that I had was to change the code myself, do it a different way, and then see if the app still ran and see how fast it was and that kind of thing. And that gave me a way to sort of like test my assumptions against the way this other person did it. And maybe sometimes it didn't work and I ended up agreeing with the way they had done it. And sometimes maybe I ended up disagreeing with the way they had done it and asking people questions about like, why was it done this way versus that way, and forming my own opinions about it, which was really helpful for me. Because one of the things that I tend to remember really well, I tend to remember when I was wrong about things a little better than when my assumptions were correct about something. They've done studies on people learning, and one thing that really helps people learn is that rather than give somebody the answer, you ask them what they think the answer should be. And if they get it wrong, then they remember the right answer better, because that element of surprise helps to cement things in the memory. So I have found that to be helpful in software engineering as well. And in teaching as well, I'll try to like ask people for the answer and give them an opportunity to think about why they think it is. Or I'll do it with software where I'll try to imagine what I think a line of code does and make a hypothesis about what should change when I change that line of code. And if that thing doesn't change, then now I have a mystery to solve. And that helps me learn things better.
Yeah, definitely. We do similar stuff in our coaches meetings, right? I turn into like an obnoxious Socratic questioning law professor who's just like, well, why do you think that? Like, what assumptions are you making? Whatever. But that just throwing information at people tends to not result in them retaining it. But if they're trying to solve some sort of problem, that seemingly opens up the capacity to actually like learn something.
It's true. I think it helps a lot. I remember certainly some of the things I remember the best from my programming career are the times where something like really went sideways, you know, and we had to fix it.
Yep. So you mentioned something about the idea of knowing multiple languages, allowing you to think about the way something is done in one context and then apply that learning to a different context. So that seems like an obvious benefit to being more of like a generalist, right? Is that by understanding, you know, things about front-end development and database structure and mobile app development, which, you know, are not necessarily the same, but share some principles that you can say, oh, well, why don't we just do it like this? Or like, why doesn't this language have that? So that's an obvious benefit to being a generalist. Are there any other benefits that you see to a more generalist approach to development?
Well, there are certainly more projects that you have the ability to contribute to faster, I think. But one thing, even if you haven't necessarily learned the language before, it is a skill to ramp up on a new language or framework. And I think somebody who's done that, somebody who knows one language maybe has never done that. And somebody who knows two languages maybe has done it once. But somebody who knows or once knew 20 languages, even if they don't remember the specific languages, they've done that ramping process 19 times, you know, from a previous body of software engineering experience. And so to learn language number 21 is not scary to them the way that learning language number 2 would be for somebody who only knew one.
Yeah, for sure. That there's the meta skill of learning a language in and of itself.
Right.
What about drawbacks? I mean, because as in pretty much anything that I'm interested in, I tend to be someone who, you know, will sort of go wide and be like, oh, I'm interested in this. Oh, let me like subscribe to this blog and I'm going to read this and listen to this podcast and listen to these 15 different bands and just kind of like take in a lot of different stuff. But I understand there's obviously a trade-off there in terms of going deep with any of those things. What trade-offs do you see, you know, relative to specializing versus being more of a generalist?
Yeah, absolutely. So when it comes to specializing, a lot of times you can go deep and learn a lot of the idiosyncrasies of a language that may not necessarily be true for other languages or frameworks. And so if you've been working on one specific language for like 20 years or something like that, then you can have a lot more insight into the way that everything is happening under the hood. You can collect all these little tricks for maybe how to do things easier in that specific stack. And so you don't necessarily have the benefit of all of the lessons that other language communities have learned, but you do have the benefit of understanding how this specific language evolved and maybe some of the like shortcuts that you can use to make things go a little faster and do things with a little bit less overhead. And so that can be an advantage there. I do think that advantage is more mitigated in software than maybe it is in a more mature discipline, because languages and frameworks change fairly frequently. The number that I tend to quote is 8 months. If somebody's out of software engineering for 8 months, their skills are now obsolete given the speed with which most languages and frameworks change. And some of them are changing even faster than that. Swift, the programming language is used for iOS development right now, has just reached like a place where it's starting to level off in terms of that volatility, but it's still getting updated really quickly, and things are changing all the time. And that continues to happen in software. So if you don't necessarily know exactly how this framework works today, that in 6 months, it's not going to work that way anyway. And so what I have found is that going deep on something and not staying deep in it, you end up shallowing out pretty fast. Because if you did something for 10 years and then you put it down for a year and you come back a year later, like a fair amount of stuff has changed. So something that I've sort of tried to do to capture the benefits of both sides is to be in different language communities, and then while I'm deep on a specific one, go really deep and work really hard on understanding the internal workings of that specific thing for as long as I'm working on a project in that specific thing. I sort of think of myself as being a specialist in that thing, even though I'm only going to be a quote unquote specialist in that thing for a year or however long the project's going to last.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, that I think your point about the rate of change within software development is extremely relevant, right? And that different disciplines, not just within like software things, but if we think about athletics or something like that, you can think about specializing in a sport, and you could make some sort of convincing. I know that growing up playing soccer, like we would play handball, right? Where it's like, oh, you guys are going to like learn spacing on the field or whatever, which like I really just don't think happened, right? It's like, no, play soccer. If you want to play soccer, like you should play soccer. But in other areas, that there is more carryover between different frameworks or languages or whatever. Right? Like I wonder about music, right? Does it benefit someone as a violin player to learn guitar? I have no idea. Right? Like what is transferable and what isn't transferable? Because people like that concept of like, oh yeah, you kind of learn like the meta skill, but I don't know if you do all the time.
Right. It may not work in all the disciplines the same way.
Yeah. Interesting. Great. So we talked about machine learning a little bit. This is a thing that is hyped up a lot. What do you think of the hype?
So it's a good question.
Do you believe the hype?
I think that there's a lot of opportunity in machine learning, of course. That having been said, I think that in a lot of the cases that I have seen in consulting on machine learning or in working on machine learning, there are companies that want to do it that don't necessarily have the data to do it and will not have the data to do it for an extended period of time. Because depending on the type of machine learning algorithm you're trying to use, you may need anywhere between a few thousand and several million different examples before you're getting any kind of acceptable accuracy, And so I think particularly at small companies that haven't really invested in data collection yet, a lot of times the ambitions for machine learning are a lot bigger than the opportunity there to create an accurate model. Yeah,
so it's almost like someone reads an article on A/B testing on their website, and they're like, oh, this is awesome. Like, we're going to improve our conversion rate or whatever. And it's like, yo, you get like 50 visitors per day.
Right.
Like, if you're not, getting thousands and thousands of visitors, it's just not worth it to try to do this.
Right.
So you see that as like a thing where people are like, oh, great, we're going to get all this information from our data, and they're just simply not large enough to.
Yeah, absolutely.
Got it. So what are the actual implications of machine learning that you see taking place, right? I mean, that it's certainly something that people talk about a lot. And this understanding of like, oh, everyone has your data and is tracking it, and companies are advertising based upon that, or developing new products, or potentially creating new drug molecules and things like that. Like, what are the actual things that are relevant and potentially beneficial from machine learning?
Sure. So I think that I think we're still in very much a research mode when it comes to machine learning. And I think that it's beneficial now in terms, I think a lot of the experimental stuff, even if it doesn't work, I think is valuable for getting a good idea of where machine learning is going to be useful for us and where it's not necessarily going to be useful for us. I think that right now, for better or for worse, the companies with a lot of data and a lot of money, they are focused on getting people to click on ads. And so a lot of a disproportionate amount of the effort that goes into machine learning research is like algorithms to get people to click on ads or something. And there's, of course, there's like other fields that attempt to use it for things like, for example, what you were saying, to assemble proteins or to like provide a virtual assistant or like some sort of conversation bot, that type of thing. And it's just disproportionately so much less. But I think that a lot of the opportunity in machine learning is going to revolve around figuring out how to take the work that humans are best at and allow them to shine in that area, and take the work that an automated solution is best at and allow it to shine in that area, because it's not necessarily the same thing. I work at a company right now, a nonprofit organization. It's called the Zooniverse. We make an app for citizen science. So people download the app onto their phone and they can help scientific researchers to classify images of galaxies and that kind of thing. Or to look at wildlife cameras from the Serengeti that are motion activated and determine whether there's animals in them or not, that kind of thing. And that allows researchers to get a whole bunch of classifications really quickly. And sometimes maybe there are 4 million images from the Hubble Space Telescope, And it would take a really long time to get people to manually classify 4 million images. But maybe if humans classified 1 million of those images, we could start to develop a confidence interval around a model trained on those 1 million images. And then we could automatically classify the other 3 million images and know that if the thing classified with more than 90% confidence, there's like a 90% chance that it was correct or something, or a 95% chance that it was correct, or an 85% chance it's correct. Figure out what our threshold is around that, and then only show humans the ones we're not sure about, and already have classifications for the ones that we're pretty sure about. So that's an opportunity there, is scaling in a situation like that. That having been said, one of the things that makes a lot of the projects really memorable is the times that like one of the volunteers finds an image that like looks a little weird, and they put it inside of the talk channel, inside of the chat channel for the project, and they say to the researchers, "This looks really weird. I don't really know what it is. I thought I would bring it to your attention." And then people start talking about it, and it turns out it's like a galaxy that we hadn't ever discovered before, or it's a type of galaxy that we'd never discovered before. For example, there's this image. It's called Hanny's Voorwerp, I think, which I think Voorwerp, it's like Dutch or something, but it means like thingamajig.
Okay, yeah.
And so this volunteer named Hanny put this on the talk channel and was like, "I found this Voorwerp inside of this picture, and I really don't know what it is." And it was this like new object that nobody had seen before, and now that's its name, Hanny's Voorwerp. You can look it up on Wikipedia and see the image. And that kind of thing, like, an algorithm's not going to do that, And so there is a case to be made for the fact that both types of classification are valuable here, but it's important to understand that they complement each other. They don't replace each other. And so when I hear these concerns about like, AI is going to replace us all and we're not going to have jobs and that kind of a thing, like to some degree, that's not inherent to machine learning. That's because that's the way that this company that's trying to save its personal self money is going to attempt to do it, is by making this machine that doesn't take pay and then cutting a whole bunch of the workforce. That having been said, is that going to work? Maybe it is. Maybe it's not going to work. But ultimately, there are skills, like there are human skills that we haven't figured out how to automate yet. And there are opportunities in automation that just take a lot less time automated than with human skills. And a lot of times they can complement each other.
Yeah, and I think that there's some just general, I would say, confusion between the way machine learning currently works and then this sort of concept of a more generalized artificial intelligence. right? And that those can be part of the same conversation, but that I think that it is something that the pattern matching of our current machine learning capabilities is not the same thing as like an artificial general intelligence that's going to replace all humans doing something.
Yeah, absolutely not. I think, everybody's got an opinion on this, and some people think we're 10 years away from like artificial generalized intelligence, and some people think we're never going to get to artificial generalized intelligence. The empirical evidence does not suggest to me that it's like going to happen on a relatively quick time scale. And particularly, I think part of that is because we are so focused on machine learning for these commercial types of applications. You see these big companies, they have a ton of money and a ton of research to throw at this. And the result of their algorithm, like let's take Amazon, for example. Oh, you just bought a wallet? Here's 16 other wallets you might be interested in.
Yeah.
Or YouTube, who at this point have made themselves practically famous for labeling anything LGBTQ as adult content, which is absurd and even more marginalizing, for an entire already marginalized community. And it's like, all right, y'all are the big rich companies, and like this is the best that you can come up with, says something about the state of research as a whole,
Yeah. Have you seen the pranking AI where it's categorizing like pictures of sheep?
Oh my gosh, I haven't.
It's very funny. I'll find it and I'll send it to you. I'll post it in the show notes as well. But someone who is some sort of machine learning researcher is like, everyone's worried about artificial intelligence taking over the world, but here's some stuff that my artificial intelligence just did. And they have all these pictures of like hills, right, with no sheep on it,
yeah.
But clearly the algorithm has been trained where it sees hills and thinks that there's sheep in the picture, and there's like flowers in it, and it's like a herd of orange sheep grazing. It's like labeling it. It's very funny.
Oh my gosh.
It's very cute. There's like a funny like cuteness to a lot of these like pranking AI and like the artificial intelligence menus that it makes of like absurd recipes and things like that.
Oh, so you're familiar with Janelle Shane's work then?
Apparently, yes.
I think it's Janelle Shane. So she does these like generative artificial intelligence things. And so what she'll do is she'll show it like a whole bunch of rock band names, and then it generates rock band names. And then she takes the funniest ones and gets an illustrator to illustrate them.
Oh, man.
And it's stuff like radioactive soup or like whatever, the Thuds,
yeah.
And stuff like that. And like, it's just too funny. She did cat names one time, and I think one of the cat names was like this bastard or something like that.
Yeah, that's cool. The recipes ones, I'll find some of those too. Those had me crying. So just like it would like make these recipes, and it would just have like these absurd, like numbers of things or like fake ingredients or whatever.
Yeah. Put shrimp in cake, run around block, serve chilled.
Yeah.
Or something.
Yep. Exactly. Well, so we kind of talked about YouTube already, but I mean, if we think about, what are the current applications that people are interacting with machine learning, like a huge aspect of that is these algorithmic recommendations, right? Where we have these large companies incentivized to increase engagement, to try to get ad clicks, et cetera. And that's sort of created this pretty negative situation, I would say, right? I'll put it out there that I think that the algorithmically curated newsfeed on Facebook and algorithmic recommendations on YouTube and things like that are just like a huge net negative for humanity. So if we do have concerns about the role of machine learning, we have an example of this quote unquote artificial intelligence already changing our behavior in a potentially negative way. So what are your thoughts surrounding how we can potentially mitigate those problems moving forward?
It's a good question. This is something that comes up on Twitter a lot because Twitter is always futzing with the way that your newsfeed appears.
Yeah.
And I'm in the camp that I would like my newsfeed to appear of all of the things that anybody I follow has posted in reverse time order of when they were posted. And that is what I would want, and that is not what Twitter would want. And, sort of like a similar thing with a lot of these sort of algorithmic approaches. I think there's just a lot of opportunity for error in those kinds of things. And if people don't know exactly how it works, whereas like with the news feed posted in recency order, I would know exactly how it was working, And I think that when it comes to, the YouTube recommendations have gotten a lot of flack, and rightfully so, because, for example, they direct children to extremely racist videos, and because the thing is, people put the most ridiculous stuff on YouTube, and the algorithms then direct people to it, and the consequences can be so severe that, some news organization absolutely blows up YouTube's spot when it happens, and they should, because there's evidently not enough supervision as to why these things are working the way that they're working. When you base things on prior examples, you end up with some really strange stuff happening. Twitter recently had a similar situation where, everybody says the 2 or 3 most important things that Twitter could do that Twitter refuses to do are, first of all, the newsfeed thing that I mentioned, second of all, make it possible to edit tweets, and third of all, ban the Nazis. Which they have to do in Germany, and so we know that they have the technology to do it. But here in the United States, they cannot use that algorithm because it would also penalize a lot of politicians, and I won't get too much into the specific sect of politicians, but I'll let you Google that. And so they don't want to do it because it would look like partisan political silencing, which I think, maybe sends a message that isn't necessarily the message Twitter wanted to send. But so those are the kinds of situations you can end up in, because, anytime that you're trying to algorithmically determine which opinions online somebody is going to want to listen to, you're on the edge of such a cliff there that one wrong step, even if it's not necessarily such a big wrong step, you're in these extremely controversial areas. And so everybody has this tendency to think that whatever the algorithm is biased heavily against whatever their view happens to be.
Of course.
So, and so I think that these companies are determined to play around in that area, but it's playing with fire in a way that is not necessarily safe.
Yeah. And that we have, like you talked about earlier, we as humans are sort of deciding what we want these algorithms to promote, right? And so the companies are deciding to promote things that seem to, improve engagement or sharing or whatever. And then through unintended consequences, that seems to result in, just fanning the flames of outrage and controversy and, extremist behavior. But we also have this issue of these algorithms are then being trained on the behavior of the people who are engaging with it. And then the people who are most likely to engage with it are probably these quote unquote hyper clickers, right? Who click on everything and share everything. And some huge percentage of them are probably mentally ill. So the algorithm is then being trained on a specific set of behaviors that are not necessarily, indicative of the way most people want to use or should be using the service, but they're giving they're feeding most of the data into the system. And it's just kind of it's just a mess.
Right. Yeah, you have probably some of that 20/80 principle going on where 80% of the data is coming from 20% of the users.
Yeah. Yeah. And that then, that in and of itself then changes the behavior of the other users who are using the service. That it's not just I'm the type of person who would tend to get outraged online. It's, I'm being exposed to these things that do radicalize me or outrage me or whatever. So yeah, I mean, it's just so interesting that we have this technology that is clearly very powerful, and then just through some pretty basic, the game of life, you just make a few basic rules, and then what happened?
Yeah, yeah, exactly. It's a tough one, and a lot of times it's exacerbated by the fact that with a machine learning algorithm, some of them are a little more black boxy than others, but it can be difficult to determine exactly why or how the thing is making the decisions that it's making, is determining that this thing is the thing that you're most likely going to want to watch next. You can look at weights sometimes, but again, depending on the complexity of the model, it can be difficult to even derive meaning from the numbers under the hood of what's happening in there. And so it's one of the big kind of research areas now, which I think makes a lot of sense, has to do with model explainability. So now we're not focused solely on accuracy, we're focused on being able to analyze what's happening inside of these models so that we can get a better idea of how to guard against that kind of stuff, in the future. And then the other part of that is the training data. So we have training data, for a lot of, we've talked a little bit about the size of data set that you need to achieve anything close to accuracy with all but the simplest models. And to get that kind of data set, a lot of times we can't necessarily produce it fresh right now. We're looking at historical data, we're looking at historical text, historical images, that kind of thing. And, there's a lot of bias associated with what's available, that texts from certain populations survived and others didn't. Images from certain populations survived and others didn't. And so we're prevented from providing a balanced view to an algorithm.
Yeah. What about, so you mentioned the idea of actually being able to explain how decisions are being made by algorithms. So my understanding of this is relatively basic, but my understanding is that we essentially create these very complicated, branching trees of decisions, right? Where it's kind of like learning all these different abstractions that tie together like different pieces of data, and then it's making like a very messy decision tree of okay, well, if it's like this, then move to this decision tree, and then if it's like this, then move to this decision tree. But it's not the same way that a human would do it, because it's weighting all these things in a pretty messy way. So even if we were to look at it, it would just make no sense to us. Is that a somewhat accurate way of explaining what's actually going on?
Yeah. So what you're describing is a particular type of algorithm called decision tree classifier. And that is generally the idea of how it works. A lot of times, to get a decision tree classifier to be accurate, it needs to be relatively complex. And so you could draw a picture of the trees, but it would be absolutely huge, and it could potentially depend on several different features at once. And the features aren't necessarily always clearly named, it's just it extracted.
Yeah, it figured out this thing about the image.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, that there's a pixel over here or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah. And so it gives that feature some name that's 123 XYZ. And you're well, I have no idea what that even entails. So there's some effort into that. It's easier with some types of data than with others to mess around with something like that. But there are some of the simpler models that are relatively easier to explain. A simple decision tree with well-named variables, you can start to get an idea of what's happening under there. You could also use a linear classifier, for example, and let's say that you're trying to determine whether a house would be one that you want to look at or not, for purchase or something. And how many bathrooms, how many bedrooms, the price, the location, all the stuff. And essentially, you classify some houses as, yes, I wanted to look at that one, and no, I didn't want to look at that one. And then when new house data becomes available, it attempts to draw a line with the data that you provided between, so you can imagine an XY plane, and you have green dots, and those are all the ones you wanted to see. And you have red dots, and they're all the ones that you didn't want to see. It's going to try to draw a line in between a cluster of green dots and a cluster of red dots to get as few wrong as possible. And what it's going to do is it's going to weight all these different factors. So, for example, it'll give a weight to price, and it'll give a weight to number of bathrooms, and a weight to number of bedrooms, and that kind of thing. And that type of model is relatively interpretable, because when you get a new house onto there, let's say, you can calculate based on all of these different features times their weights added together, where it's going to be on there, and which side of the line that is. Mm-hmm. So that one's relatively easier. I built a tool to visualize the way algorithms like that are making decisions in the past. So some of them you can kind of look at.
If we have discrete categories that we're sort of weighting, we're basically just making a linear model.
Right.
And that you can articulate that.
Right, exactly. One thing that's nice about that is you can determine whether something has a negative result or a positive result. So, for example, say there were a positive weight on number of bathrooms, that says that generally the more bathrooms there are, the more interested you are. Or there could be a negative weight on, price or something. The more expensive it is, the less you want to see it.
How haunted the house is.
Right. Amount of hauntedness. You have to figure out how to quantify hauntedness. Those are like really the big problems with a lot of this is like, how do I quantify this thing that I'm trying to, identify or that kind of a thing. But even with something like decision trees, you have what's called feature importance. And because there's all these complex interactions, it can be difficult to figure out like whether this feature is a net, like, is that indicating that it isn't this class or is that indicating that it is this class? And sometimes you can do some extra work to try to triangulate it, but it just gets harder, And then when you have something like a neural network with like millions and millions of nodes and all this different possibilities going on, it gets to the point where it's just, at the moment, very difficult to interpret.
So if we are trying to have some level of explainability of these decisions for some of the more complicated types of systems, what does that look like?
It's a good question. A lot of it has focused so far on an attempt to aggregate some of these variables into something that like sort of means something. So, for example, for a lot of text data, there's a really good, I don't know how many people listening to this are Game of Thrones watchers, but there's this really interesting data visualization that somebody did.
Is this a spoiler?
It's not a spoiler. I don't watch Game of Thrones. I like to say that I'm on Twitter, which is basically the same thing, but I don't know like enough probably to spoil anything that hasn't been spoiled on Twitter. But what it does is it takes all of the words that appear in any Game of Thrones and it determines which ones appear in the same contexts. And then it graphs them and shows them like close to each other in the graph. And so the result was that names that like appeared a lot together in the books ended up appearing close to each other in this graph. And this is, millions and millions of words of text and comes up with this graph that evidently, funny you should mention, contained spoilers because some of the names appeared close to like, I could have this wrong, but evidently people were upset because somehow you could figure out who was going to die.
Yeah.
Based on this chart.
Yeah. Yep.
So, my understanding of Game of Thrones is that everyone dies. So I don't really know why any of that was a spoiler, but it is pretty cool. It's like cool to look at and see like how people are trying to turn this into interpretable information, because ultimately part of it is that it's not even necessarily that we don't know how the algorithms made decisions. We are basing this on human classifications, and we don't even know how we made these decisions. I think we overestimate how certain we are about how we decided something and why we decided that thing. When in reality, far more often than we're prepared to admit, we don't use these logical reasons to reach a conclusion. We reach a conclusion based on a gut feeling, and then we go back and we figure out logical data that supports our conclusion, and then we tell people that that's why we made the decision.
Yeah. So can we teach algorithms to do that, to come up with human-style post hoc rationalizations for their behavior?
I mean, I'm sure that Janelle has tried, and I would love to read them. If they're half as entertaining as the recipes, then I would absolutely love to see it. Just feed it a whole bunch of decisions people made and then their justifications for why they made it and see what it comes up with.
Yeah, there'd be some good text there.
Right.
So something else that you've written about is diversity in tech hiring, right? And I think that anyone who follows any sort of tech journalism or anything has some awareness of problems with bro culture and various companies, as well as just an overall diversity gap in like technical fields. And so, I guess I'll put my cards on the table and say essentially that in general, I find identity politics to be a relatively unhelpful way of looking at things, but I simultaneously am very concerned with lack of opportunity for people, right? That I think that by leaving huge percentages of people's brains offline from like solving hard problems, that's like a really bad idea. So I'm kind of like, I sort of sit in a weird middle spot with the way that most people approach problems like this. But I would like to hear what you think the actual issue is and what should be done about it. Yeah.
So I think that your point about identity politics is interesting, because one thing that I have found as well is that, like, suppose that you're giving somebody an employee review and you've received a bunch of negative feedback from, like, I don't know, let's say people of color on the team, that this person is not listening to what they have to say. If you go into their employee review and you're like, well, we need to work on your racism, I have found that even if that is true, it's not necessarily, doesn't work, you know?
The outcome will not be what you desire.
Right. It's not, they're not going to go and work on it. They're going to shut down. And does that say something about the fragility of those people and they have a lot of things to work on? Absolutely. It does, 100%. And there's a lot of work for people from dominant groups to do with regard to understanding how to accept that feedback and use it to make themselves better allies and better people. That having been said, I have found that from a practical standpoint, a helpful way for me to think about that has been, rather than focusing on specific identities in something like an employee evaluation, what I'll end up doing is focusing on specific skills. How good is this person at listening to opinions that are different from theirs? How good is this person at incorporating information that they didn't previously consider in making their opinions known? How good is this person at soliciting the opinions of people who are not going to feel the confidence to lob their opinions across the room? And how good are these people at engaging in disagreement in a way that doesn't make people feel like they're spending their social capital just to converse with this person? And so then I can figure out, all right, I've got all these complaints about this person. Are there specifics, like which of these skills do those line up with? And can I talk to them about those skills? Because that conversation is something that they can come out of with, like, this is something that I need to make sure that I'm much better at, as opposed to, this is the person that I'm supposed to be that I'm not, you know? And once again, although that may be true, it's not, I think we are not at a point, I think it's still far too rare for folks from dominant groups to have actively thought about, like, how do I work on myself and how do I accept critical feedback? I think accepting critical feedback is a whole skill set that in general people could work on more. And as long as that's the case, I think it makes sense to look for ways to talk about that kind of thing in a way that's going to bridge that gap a little bit and help people examine that critical feedback as a behavior that they can change.
Yeah, interesting. So in terms of actually getting, change from an individual, in general, focusing on behaviors and skills is an appropriate way to focus on it. Right?
I think it helps.
Yeah, that people can understand their behavior and develop new skills, which is not the same thing as, like, you need to check your privilege, which is, like, very abstract and not necessarily helpful to someone, especially if they don't understand or buy into the paradigm of, different identity groups battling for some sort of social power.
Right.
Like, I don't even know what you're talking about.
Right. One thing that I find often when I write about this type of topic is that, like, to even begin to understand what I'm about to say, somebody is going to have to understand, like, all this stuff that is not necessarily a given. And so a lot of times, particularly on the inclusion-related posts, I'll find myself having to say at the beginning, like, warning, this is a relatively advanced piece on the topic of inclusion, and I would recommend you read these 6 things first. And if you take offense when, like I'm going to use the term white men, and if that's gonna be really hard for you, this is not the piece for you right now. Maybe this other piece is a piece for you right now, and then come back when you understand that, like, that I'm saying it in this context, and I'm not accusing you personally, person I don't know, of, doing this thing.
Yeah, so if we think about the actual skills, I mean, you mentioned a few of them, but what do you see as the tangible skills that people can work on that will improve, let's say, diversity and opportunity in particularly tech workplaces?
Yeah, I think it really helps to have sort of a rubric for evaluating people on, I call them, like, inclusion skills, but I don't think that they have to focus, again, on any particular subgroup. I think they're skills that make a working environment better for everyone, and disproportionately better for those people for whom this working environment has been toxic in the past. And so I think there are a number of things there. I think the first step is definitely learning to listen. And I have this post where I lay out like 5 specific skills that are really helpful. Maybe we could put it in the show notes or something.
Definitely.
But it talks a little bit about what people can do. And a lot of it has to do with the way that folks are considering the fact that their opinion may not be the same as the universal view on something. I think that there is a fair amount of conflating in the tech community of like, I know X and everyone knows X, or I feel X and everyone feels X. And that's not necessarily the case. It's very important to understand that there are other viewpoints out there, and that generally what we hear are the dominant viewpoints, the viewpoints that people are going to want to lob out into the world. This is even something that applies to the technical research that I'm doing when I'm learning about a new concept. Like, if all of the articles that I'm reading express this one opinion on something, that almost always means that some other opinion has been subverted. And I'll go looking specifically for that opinion because I want to know what it is and why it's been subverted, which gives me a better understanding of the way that people are doing things now. So I think it's important to learn about, figuring out who's not going to be as loud on this topic. How do I go find that person and convince them that I'm a trustworthy source to express their opinion to, and get them to express it, and then figure out how to reflect on that? Because what they say might not be very comfortable for me, which is why they're not necessarily going to express it to me until I convince them. And then how do I demonstrate that I'm good for this trust that I've earned from them in introspecting on this and figuring out whether my viewpoint on the issue has been missing something all this time? Maybe there's a better solution than the one that I was imagining when I start to bring other people into the conversation who otherwise might not be there and would be completely missing.
Yeah, so if we think about, I guess, viewpoint diversity as a pretty tangible way to look at this, right? This is something that I think a lot of people understand is beneficial in the abstract, right? That you want to have different opinions, you want to kind of hash it out. But I think in practice, it can be challenging to understand when it's appropriate and valuable to have a bunch of different viewpoints, and then at some point a decision has to be made.
Right.
And then I see a lot of conflict, in my workplace and other people's workplaces when I hear about it, because it seems like people are playing a different game a lot of the time with that. Mm-hmm. And that someone thinks it's time to make a decision and move on, and other people think it's time to have a bunch of ideas. And that, like you mentioned, a lot of people never actually put their ideas out there, and then they have them, and then they're frustrated because they foresaw something potentially going wrong that no one ever asked them about. So in terms of actual practical application of this, what do you think is the process for, not just facilitating these conversations and increasing viewpoint diversity, but finding that balancing act between, great, we're going to actually talk about this and get everyone's input, but then some sort of decision does have to be made and someone is going to be upset about it?
Yeah. So in software engineering, we have this concept of a thing in our applications called an architectural decision record. And this is where we say, we chose to make this architectural decision. These were the options that we weighed. This is why we went with this one. And then we store that often somewhere in version control so that there's some record of why we made the decisions that we made. It's also very important in machine learning, arguably even more important because the algorithms can be so black boxy that it's important to describe, this is why we added this feature. This is why we tried this engineering. It didn't work, but we keep the record of it so that if someone else later down the line is like, why don't we try engineering this feature? We can be like, we tried that. It was terrible. Here's the decision record about it. So I think that it can be helpful to have a similar concept inside of an organization, a cultural decision record, if you will, where we are making a big decision. All right, so we make a record of it. We record what the different ideas were about how to resolve this. We say that we're going with this one and why. And if it turns out that we were wrong, one of the people who foresaw exactly what happened now has evidence that they said this was going to happen. And that gives them some opportunity to reprise the decision. Or the next time we make the decision, they can say, well, we refer to this cultural decision record, this is what I said was going to happen, and it did. So maybe now that we're doing this other thing, consider that I'm making a similar prediction.
Yeah, got it. So if we think about the, bigger picture perspective of, if we do want more viewpoint diversity in technology companies, right? that's something that I think that a lot, and companies say, hey, like we're trying, we're working on it, whatever. But it seems like, if you just look at the various numbers of people of different backgrounds involved in technical industries or sitting on board seats or in C-suite places or whatever, that the numbers don't look fantastic with that. We just talked about some very tangible things that people can do in terms of like management style and like actual interactions with employees, which could hopefully make, a more welcoming workplace. But what do you think is from a bigger picture perspective, what do you think actually needs to be done?
So they've done a couple of longitudinal studies on this that have been interesting because they've demonstrated that outcomes for the company, both in terms of employee, like the sort of culture, if you will, whatever the amorphous metrics are for culture, as well as like straight up bottom line for companies, they're seeing both of those things improve when they have a more diverse set of people in leadership. And they're always a little bit of difficult studies to sell, because it's like, well, the result of this study is like literally, if you want to do better, put more women on boards. And that's, for whatever reason, a message that gets a lot of backlash because it seems so simple and people are like, oh, well, how are we gonna make sure that the candidates are qualified? Like completely disregarding the fact that equally qualified people of different genders, one is overwhelmingly more likely to get the position, And so, in those kinds of situations, I think it's really, really helpful to start at the top. And that can be a really difficult thing to do because, like, folks from underrepresented groups, it's not that fun for them to go into an organization and be, like, for example, like the only woman on the board for a number of reasons. Like, their opinion's going to get discounted more often. They're going to be turned to for the woman's view on things. They could potentially get harassed. They're not dying to do it. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is there are just fewer people from underrepresented groups going for those top positions, because in order to go for those top positions, you have to have been in industry for a while. And people get harassed so much that they leave. And so as you go up in seniority, the proportion of the group that comes from an underrepresented group becomes smaller and smaller. And it becomes really important to think about doing some of the things that we've talked about, just sort of like explicitly inclusive practices, and then go looking specifically for those people, like finding people who would be a good fit on your board that fill perspective gaps that are missing for you right now. Like, say our board is all white people, like that could potentially be a problem in ways that we don't even anticipate. We make this facial recognition software, and it doesn't occur to us until later that, like, this thing only represents white faces appropriately. Not that that's ever happened at a large and reputable company, Google. But, so first it's identifying, like, these are our gaps. We need to specifically find people to fill those gaps. And now we need to go find those people, which is going to mean it's not going to be putting out a call and saying, all interested parties, please apply to here, because they're not going to apply, because they're not interested, because they're looking at your current board and they're seeing what a pain in the neck it's going to be to try to be the only person in their demographic. And so it's sort of a screening tactic that folks use to figure out, like, what's going to be the least miserable work environment for me? Because people have been working a long time in the industry. They're jaded. They're tired. They're angry. The jar of patience is empty. There is none left. And so they're trying to go places that aren't going to ask them to get out a big scoop of patience anymore, because they're out. It's done. And so those companies have to try to figure out how to get around those screens. And a lot of it's going to be reaching out individually, like, hi, X person, I was reviewing your resume and I think it's really interesting that you worked at X company. I think that some of the skills that you use to do that would be really valuable for us. We're prepared to bring you in here. We're prepared to listen to your recommendations. We're prepared to implement on what you say. And we're going to pay you the top amount that somebody in this position would reasonably make. In part because we understand that there's going to be friction associated with you trying to take up this position. And to some degree, it's kind of hazard pay, to do that and be like the first person being like the sort of shock troops of diversity at the top to some degree, Because what that's going to do is once you have those people at the top, they can help inform the decision making around the rest of the company culture in a way that's going to make the place much more attractive to folks like further down the org chart to come. That's one thing that I'm looking at when I'm looking at companies. I want to look at what the leadership is like, because it's easier to be quote unquote diverse when like all of your juniors are from an underrepresented group, and that brings your number up, but nobody has to listen to them. When people who have a lot of sway in the company come from a wide variety of backgrounds, the outcome is almost invariably better.
Yeah, I'm not terribly up to date with all the different social science research, and also, with current replication crises occurring, maybe a little skeptical of it. But I mean, in a lot of contexts, it seems that diversity makes people uncomfortable, upsets them, creates conflict, etc., but that the overall outcome is potentially better, right? So it's like this very challenging thing of like, no one likes it, but it's good for you.
Oh, absolutely. I think the tolerance for discomfort in workplaces, we could work a lot on raising tolerance for discomfort in workplaces. And we see that in a number of different venues. Like you're saying, disagreement, so uncomfortable that just the introduction of a diverse set of opinions is terrifying for people. Responding to critical feedback, like we talked about before. All of those things, they represent discomfort in the workplace. We're not used to fielding or creating any space for what we think of as like negative emotions in the workplace, anger and sadness and even just frustration. You're not even allowed to be frustrated at work. That's unprofessional. But like, by definition, I spend the majority of my waking hours doing this. If I weren't frustrated about things, like, maybe some people don't get frustrated at work. I don't have that personality type yet, hopefully maybe one day I'll grow into it. But I spend so much time on this thing. I'm so invested. There's going to be where there's investment, there's going to be frustration, and so there's got to be some sort of like understanding that there's going to be times where I'm frustrated at work. There's going to be times where I'm angry. There's going to be times where I'm sad. And there's got to be, once we figure out how to make space for the fact that like we're people at work and we're going to be people at work, and that's going to include all of these emotions that we don't necessarily think of as professional because, like our limbic system doesn't understand professional. That's not, it doesn't care, Once we can start to make space for like, sometimes my coworkers get frustrated, angry, or sad. How do I deal with that as a coworker? How do I deal with that as a manager? How do I learn to work with people in like a reasonable, personable way, understanding that kind of thing's going to happen sometimes? I think that's going to create a lot more opportunity to deal with disagreement and critical feedback and all these things that make us stronger, even though they kind of suck in the moment,
Yeah, that ability to just tolerate discomfort seems to be crucial for just about anything worth doing.
Yeah. I was talking to somebody about this the other day, that like growth, like my experiences of growth and the things that have changed me the most, like none of them were comfortable. There was discomfort associated with all of them. And maybe there's a situation where growth doesn't require discomfort, but I haven't encountered it myself.
Have you seen any organizations handle these types of diversity issues well?
It's a good question. I think that some organizations do. I think that the leaders in this area, at least in tech, have been some specific tech conferences. And I don't know if that's related to the fact that this is a wild speculation. Take this with like no grains of salt, or a grain of salt, a lot of grains of salt. I don't know how this analogy works.
An entire Trader Joe's Himalayan pink sea salt.
Every salt, the whole Dead Sea, all of it. That having been said, maybe because a lot of times when you have conference organizers, they're not doing it full time. So they're not so invested vested in it as to create so much frustration around. They don't associate their personal identity with the conference as much, which means they accept critical feedback better. Maybe. Whereas like if they're a software engineer and someone has critical feedback about their software engineering, maybe that feels more personal. Once again, wild speculation. But what I have seen is that some specific conferences tend to be much more forward thinking in this area. PearConf comes to mind. It's based out in San Francisco. Ruby for Good comes to mind. I think that one's based out of Washington, D.C. But they seem to be the leaders on figuring out, like, how do we create an environment where someone's allowed to be sad without getting, like, professionally blocked as this, like, unprofessional, quote unquote, emotional person. Because, you know, we're all, like, once you're labeling people as emotional, it's like, well, congratulations, that's everyone. We're all, you know, if having a normal emotional range is considered too emotional, then we've got a lot of stuff to figure out. So that's where I've seen maybe the most headway on those things. And I've seen some companies start to take a little bit of a lead from some of those conferences. But that's where I look when I'm looking at, like, what's the leading edge of making space for everybody in the same spot.
Yeah, got it. I would hypothesize that the conference organizers are potentially much more aware of the fact that they're serving specific clients, right? So they're more interested in feedback and people's experiences.
Yeah.
And that a software engineer, like I think you mentioned, is probably more like, this is my thing that I made. Yeah,
absolutely. And I think to some degree, the amount of money and demand in the tech industry buffers engineers specifically against having to learn to sell themselves.
Like, oh, you work. Like poor technical people with bad social skills. We'll insulate you from all of this.
Right, exactly. And it's like, you know, it wouldn't be so bad if they had to, like, get somebody to like them every once in a while. That's not to typecast all engineers, but, like, you know, I think it's valuable. It's a strengthening exercise to understand, like, empathy as a skill rather than empathy as, like, a thing that you have or a thing that you don't have. It's a skill that can be developed. It's a strength that can be developed, just like I think a lot of things that we tend to view as you either have it or you don't.
Yeah, that it might not be the natural way of being in the world, but that doesn't mean you can't learn the behaviors associated with that and start to develop that. Right,
exactly. It's like, I'll never go to the CrossFit Games, but I'll be able to squat far more than I, like, inherently could. Yeah. I have to practice, you know, and I have to be deliberate about tweaking it and everything. So I think it's the same thing with anything like that.
Yeah, not arching your back so much.
Yeah, that's one thing I'm working on.
Yeah, it's gotten better.
Good.
All right, Chelsea, so you talked about your blog a few times. Do you want to send people there?
Yeah, I can. It's chelseatroy.com, ChelseaTroy.com. We can put it in the show notes too, I imagine. But it's a lot of, like, cussing about tech, so if you're interested in that kind of thing, hopefully you'll like it. If you don't, that's okay, I guess. I try to be unabashedly myself on there, and then when people contact me through the blog about work, I know, like, they know who I am, basically, and I don't have to worry as much about, like, coming off as whatever person they're looking for.
Yeah, there you go. That's a good way to be. I will be who I am, and if you like it, fine.
Yeah. I mean, I'm privileged in that I write code, and so people, like, to some degree, the demand is on my side, and I can sort of, like, be maybe a little more who I am than people in other industries could safely do, which is nice. But for me, it has worked out well.
Great. Anything else you want people to do?
Eat your greens, drink a lot of water, get sleep.
Excellent health tips.
I could follow some of them better myself.
Yeah, wonderful. All right, great. Thanks for listening all the way through. I admire your grit, your persistence, and your perseverance. Since you made it, I have a few favors to ask of you. Go ahead and open up the show notes on whatever podcast player you use. In there, you'll find links to all the resources that were mentioned throughout the show. There's also some links there in which you can leave a review or subscribe to the show. And podcasters are always harping on this because this actually makes a difference in terms of the algorithms that recommend podcasts to new people. So if you do that, it helps more people find the show. And if you head over to toddneef.com, you can sign up to receive most of my thoughts and writing, which really only go out to the email list. A lot of it never makes it to the blog or the podcast. So if you like what I have to say and you want to see some of my recommendations and stuff that I've been checking out, go ahead and subscribe to that email newsletter as well.